Lesson 4, the four Gospels. An introduction to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Last lesson was important because we talked about some of the key essentials that we want to keep in mind when we enter into a study of the four Gospels. But I want to return to the very first one because this one is what I want to unpack in this lesson as we introduce the four Gospels. So the first point of those 7 points when it came to how we go about studying the Gospels was this. The four Gospels were written to provide four unique portraits of Jesus Christ. So we introduced this idea that we have these four different portraits last lesson, but we didn't unpack what they are. And so that's what this lesson is designed to do. How are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's portraits of Christ different yet complementary to one another? That's what this lesson's all about. So that's how we want to introduce each gospel. So let's go through each one and let's talk about each one as a separate portrait of Jesus of Nazareth. So let's start with Matthew. So when we start with the book of Matthew, who is Jesus to Matthew? Well, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So Matthew's gospel is the most Jewish-focused of all four of the Gospels. He heavily focuses on fulfilled Jewish prophecy, how he is the Messiah that they've been waiting for. So when we read Matthew, we want to understand, we want to keep in mind that to Matthew, Jesus is the one they've been waiting for. He is the fulfillment of Old Testament hope. So we see lots of quotations, lots of references, really to a Jewish audience, primarily that Jesus is the Messiah that they have been told is coming and is prophesied in the Old Testament. Along with that, Matthew is the most structured of the Gospels. So Matthew is crafted around 5 carefully ordered sections. What we'll learn is that Matthew loves structure. We learn that in his genealogy, and we learn that in the Gospel. So Matthew is nice because it is very carefully crafted into 5 specific sections, and we'll go through that when we unpack Matthew later in the course. But it's important to know that right now, what we want to keep in mind, the most important thing when we talk about Matthew as a portrait of Christ is that to Matthew, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. That's the most important thing. So let's talk about Mark now. So who is Jesus to Mark? What is Mark's portrait of Jesus Christ? So to Mark, Jesus is not necessarily the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. He's the suffering Son of God. This is very important when we read Mark. So to Matthew, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, but to Mark, of course, he is that as well. But the emphasis on Mark is clearly he's the suffering Son of God. This means that Jesus is the one who offers himself as a sacrifice for sin. So Mark is very deliberate on focusing on Jesus being the sacrifice necessary for sins to be forgiven. Mark is also the most dramatic of the four. So Mark is a powerful, vivid story. Some of the accounts are shorter, it moves quickly, and it's very gripping from beginning to end. So Mark is the most dramatic of the four, but the focus of Mark, to Mark, Jesus is the suffering Son of God. So we need to keep that in mind as we read Mark's account of the life of Christ. Let's talk about Luke. So who is Jesus to Luke? To Luke, Jesus is the Savior for all people. So this means that Luke's emphasis is not precisely the same as Matthew's or Mark's. Luke is really wanting to emphasize how Jesus' life and death are available to benefit everybody, the whole world, all people. So for Luke, Jesus brings salvation not just to Israel, but to all nations, all people groups forever. So Luke has a very universal feel to it. Luke is also the most thematic of the Gospels. So there's these big themes in all 4 Gospels, but of the 4, Luke is the most thematic. So we see themes like God's love for the lost, the role of the Spirit, the role of Jerusalem and God's plan. These resurface over and over and over again in the Gospel of Luke. And his emphasis is clearly that he wants the reader to see that Jesus is come to save everybody. So that's the portrait that we get of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. So lastly, let's talk about John. Who is Jesus of Nazareth to John? Well, to John, Jesus is the divine Son who reveals the Father. So Jesus to John, you will notice that later that John is very different than the other 3, but we have to keep in mind the most important thing about John is that the Gospel of John is designed to show Jesus as the divine Son of God who reveals the Father in heaven. This is the main emphasis of the Gospel of John. Jesus is the self-revelation of God the Father. So if you've read the Gospel of John, you know that lots of statements about Jesus' identity and purpose are found loud and clear in this particular Gospel. So John is the most theological of the four, and John has a lot more explicit statements about Jesus' identity as well as his purpose. John is very different from the other three synoptic gospels, but the most important thing about John is that he is attempting to show Jesus as the divine Son who reveals the Father. Jesus' deity and his purpose are on display very clearly in the Gospel of John. So let's review really quickly all four of the Gospels together. So Matthew portrays Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, the one that the Jews have been waiting for has finally come. Mark portrays Jesus as the suffering Son of God. He is the one who has taken our place, taken the wrath of God for our sin on himself and suffered in our place. To Luke, Jesus is the Savior for all people. Everybody can benefit from the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. He is the Savior for everybody, and he has come for everybody. And lastly, John gives us the fact that Jesus is the divine Son who reveals the Father. He is truly God with us. So we said also that of the Gospels, Matthew is the most structured, Mark the most dramatic, Luke the most thematic, and John is the most theological. So if we can keep these four portraits in mind, that to Matthew, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. To Mark, he's the suffering Son of God. To Luke, he's the Savior for all people. To John, he is the divine Son who reveals the Father. And Matthew being the most structured, Mark the most dramatic, Luke the most thematic, and John the most theological. Just knowing some of these essential things about the Gospels will really help set us up for success in studying it. But what's so beautiful about studying the Gospels is that although we have four Gospels together, the four Gospels that we have in the New Testament testify to the one Gospel. What is the one Gospel? It is the good news of salvation through Jesus, the Messiah. So that's a very short introduction to each of the four Gospels. What we want to do in our next lesson is talk about comparing the synoptic Gospels to the Gospel of John.